Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary, welcome. Good to see you again. I'm going to talk about issues concerning the budget in the United States Coast Guard. And Madam Secretary, I understand that in a tight fiscal environment, sacrifices have to be made. But some of the Coast Guard budget cuts seem penny-wise and pound-foolish. We've invested over $100 million in maritime safety and security teams, yet your budget proposes to cut that capacity by 42% to save $18.2 million. You propose to move to a quote-unquote regional concept with the Maritime Safety and Security Team program, yet you terminate 395 active-duty military personnel instead of transferring them to other MSST units. You cut the aviation support to the Maritime Security Response Team, the Coast Guard's elite counterterrorism team, thus eliminating the Coast Guard's tactical ability to board a vessel that is actively opposing being boarded by a law enforcement agency. And what's even more disconcerting is that as the Secretary of Homeland Security, you're supporting a potential successor to the current Commandant who wants to further degrade both the Homeland Security and search and rescue functions of the Coast Guard. I have here a memo from Vice Admiral Papp, recommended by you and nominated by the President to be the next Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. In this memo, Admiral Papp indicates a willingness to, quote, incur additional risk in order to inform the fiscal year 12 and fiscal year 16 budget build, end quote. Madam Secretary, when Admiral Papp talks about incurring additional risk, he's not talking about risk to the Coast Guard. He's talking about risk to the American public. And given that risks continue to threaten our nation, terrorism, the drug trade, human trafficking, why is it sound to put greater risk on the American people?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't know whether you heard me, there was a question raised about that. That was an early interagency memo that was leaked based on earlier budget assumptions that are not, in fact, the out-year budget assumptions for the Coast Guard. That is not the policy of the Coast Guard, nor is it the Department of DHS. And so it's difficult to respond to a leaked pre-decisional draft document in a public hearing of this nature, but Admiral Papp is highly, highly qualified to be the next Commandant of the Coast Guard, and I think the Senate and the people of America will agree. He has a very, very distinguished service record in the Coast Guard and has served the people of this country very, very well. So let's just go there. Now, with respect to the MSSTs, you are right. We have consolidated and regionalized them. It was the combined judgment with the Commandant of the Coast Guard that we could have the same reach in terms of response to possible terrorism activities at the regional level as opposed to having so many different places with their own MSST. There, I understand there can be disagreements about that. I'm sure those will be discussed throughout the appropriations process.
Thank you very much. I know you don't agree with me, kind of rolling your eyes there, but you know, the Coast Guard's current response staff is required to have an asset on the scene within 2 hours. When your life is on the line, 2 hours is it might be an attorney, is an attorney if you're in the water. But again, Admiral Papp, in his memo, seems to be willing to modify those standards. And I don't want to go further, but do you support his assertion that more risk is acceptable by loosening the standards for on-scene response times?
Representative, with all respect, I'm just not going to get into a dialogue about a draft leaked memo. That is not the policy of the Coast Guard, nor the policy of the Department of Homeland Security.
Again, I understand that, but the nominee, this is his memo. He
well,
a couple more questions then. Admiral Papp seems also interested in reducing security patrols by 10 to 15%, reducing the number of Coast Guard response boats and boat crews by cutting drug enforcement efforts by 25%. And finally, he'll end the Coast Guard's Maritime Security Response Team and has said that these reductions are, and again I quote, just a fraction of what is needed, and I'm prepared to go further, end quote. And in my humble opinion, he's gone too far. And in conclusion, again, I know you've responded to my fellow Texan about his question, and I appreciate your position. But if these radical proposals that this nominee, if these are things that he's actively thinking about that are good for the Coast Guard and he will enact when he gets into office, I think he's unqualified. And I ask that you reconsider support of his nomination. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the memo be added to the record.
Without objection.
And with that, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman